All right, get ready for this one. This deep dive might not be like a household name, but it's going to stay with you. We're going into Andre Jones and Freddie Tiller. These two guys were spree killers in East St. Louis, Illinois, back in the late 70s. And, when you think about infamous duos, Bonnie and Clyde, those names just pop right into your head. But Jones and Tiller, I mean, their story, it's just as chilling, even if it's not quite as well known.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes these cases, they kind of slip under the radar,
Right.
especially when they happen in communities that are, already struggling with a bunch of other stuff. You imagine East St. Louis in the late 70s wasn't exactly a peaceful paradise.
No, no, not at all. We've got these excerpts from a Wikipedia article on Jones and Tiller, and it really paints like a really bleak picture. So we're going to unpack their lives, their crimes, the trials, the whole thing. And what's really interesting to me, like right away, is that you see this big contrast between these two guys.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And it's super important to understand those differences because they might help us figure out, like, why they did what they did. So on the one hand, we've got Andre Jones. This guy had a criminal record all the way back to when he was 12 years old. 12 years old. He was already involved in purse snatching. By the time he was in his late teens, he'd moved on to theft, armed robbery. He even tried to kill someone. He was actually on parole for armed robbery when this whole spree started in 1979.
It's like he was on this path, like, to something terrible. But here's the really disturbing part. The article says that Jones actually confessed to a triple murder back in 1971.
Yeah, he's only 14 at the time.
14 years old, he admitted to shooting and stabbing these three young men. Arthur Lee Walson, he was 21, and then these two brothers, Frank and Jack Slaughter, they were 23 and 21. And Jones said that they owed him drug money. I mean, how do you even wrap your head around that? A 14-year-old kid doing something that brutal.
It's just awful. And it really makes you wonder, like, what did people do when he confessed? Could they have done something to stop him? Back in the 70s, people didn't really understand juvenile delinquency the way we do now. The systems they had to deal with it were totally different. There's a good chance that they didn't take his confession seriously enough.
Yeah, and that's the scary part. It's like there was this huge warning sign and nobody saw it, or maybe they just didn't want to see it.
Yeah. And it's kind of a similar thing with Freddie Tiller, unfortunately. We don't know as much about him, but from what we have, it seems like he was Jones's accomplice in this spree in 79.
Right, but I think it's important not to think of him as just a sidekick. Tiller played a big part in these crimes, and we need to look at what he did and why just as closely as we do with Jones.
Totally agree. We can't just say he's less guilty just because he wasn't, the leader or whatever.
Okay, so let's get into the 1979 spree. This wasn't just some random, spur-of-the-moment violence. This was planned out. They killed 3 people in one day.
Yeah. And the details are really important here. The first victim was this guy, Richard Stoltz, a World War II vet. He was 63 years old. Just imagine, he's stacking bricks in his truck, and Tiller comes up to him and demands money.
And when Stoltz tried to give him the money, Tiller shot him right in the eye. The article even quotes Tiller saying, "I mean business, he wouldn't up the cash." That's just chilling.
Totally. It's like he was cold.
Yeah.
No emotion at all. And then there's this other thing. Lori Ellum, Tiller's cousin, she was also Jones's girlfriend at the time.
Talk about being caught in the middle. Her testimony was really important in their trials. It gave us this inside look at the relationships and all the betrayal that you see in these kinds of cases.
It's almost Shakespearean. You've got family love and violence all mixed up together.
And the violence didn't stop there. Jones and Tiller decided to rob a dry cleaning store. They went in, and Jones just shot the owner, Samuel Nersesian. Shot him twice, right there.
Yeah, he didn't even hesitate. It's terrifying.
And then, to make things even worse, a male woman, Deborah Brown, walked in at the worst possible time.
Tiller said that he didn't want Brown to get hurt, but he didn't do anything to stop Jones. It makes you think, was he really unable to do anything, or was he just scared? Or maybe even loyal to Jones in some twisted way.
And Jones just ambushed Brown, dragged her into the kitchen, and shot her twice. Once in the chest and once in the mouth.
That's so disturbing. Shooting her in the mouth.
It's like he wanted to.
Like he wanted to make sure she was silenced forever. Not just kill her, but erase her completely.
Yeah, that's a really chilling thought. And it makes you wonder, what was going on in Jones's head? Especially with all the violence in his past, starting so young.
And thankfully, this whole thing ended a few days later on May 4th, when they finally caught Jones and Tiller. But of course, that was just the beginning of a long and messy legal battle. Oh yeah, the arrest was just the first act. What happened in the courts is a whole other story. It brings up all these questions about justice, punishment, and what evil really is. Okay, so now we're in the courtroom. This is where things get really interesting. Remember, Jones and Tiller, they had separate trials, and their cases went in very different directions.
Makes you think, did having those separate trials, like separate stories, did that change how people saw them?
Yeah, that's a good point. It shows how the way we tell these stories can affect what people think. So with Jones, it seemed pretty straightforward, at least from what the Wikipedia article says. He pleads guilty to all 3 murders in August of '79, and he gets the death sentence.
Which back then was, the ultimate punishment. But of course, the death penalty, that's a whole other can of worms, right? With all the ethical stuff and the legal debates.
Oh yeah, we can do a whole deep dive just on that. But for now, let's stick with Jones and Tiller and what happened to them.
Right, makes sense. So Jones is on death row. What about Tiller? His case seems more complicated.
Definitely. Right away, there's this motion to separate the charges for Stoltz's murder from the dry cleaning store killings. And the judge agrees.
So they're basically treating them as separate things, but why?
It's tough to say for sure without seeing all the court documents, but it was probably a strategy by the prosecutors. They were already going for the death penalty for the dry cleaning store murders, right? 2 victims. Maybe they thought adding Stoltz's murder to the mix would just make things too messy.
I guess they wanted to focus on what they had the best chance of proving. But doesn't that mean Stoltz and his family didn't really get justice?
Yeah, that's a valid point. And that wasn't the only weird thing about Tiller's case. So he's found guilty of 2 murders and 2 armed robberies. Gets the death sentence in September '79. But, get this, on appeal, they overturned the death sentences and one of the robbery convictions.
Whoa, hold on. How does that even happen? How do you get a death sentence overturned?
Well, the Illinois Supreme Court, they said the prosecution didn't prove for sure that Tiller meant for Nersesian and Brown to die during that robbery. And this is where we get into this whole thing called the felony murder rule.
I've heard of that, like in true crime documentaries and stuff, but I don't really get it. Can you explain it?
Sure. So imagine you and your buddy decide to rob a bank, right?
Yeah.
And during the robbery, your friend freaks out and shoots someone. Even though you didn't pull the trigger, you could still be charged with murder because the death happened while you were committing a felony, in this case, armed robbery.
So even if Tiller didn't shoot Brown, he was still responsible for her death because he was part of the robbery.
Exactly. But in this specific case, the court said there wasn't enough evidence to prove that Tiller planned for anyone to die during the robbery. But they still upheld the murder convictions. Their argument was that he knew Jones was dangerous, that he might hurt someone, but he didn't stop him.
Wow, so they're saying he's guilty because he didn't do anything. Interesting. It's a fine line, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So they changed his sentence to life in prison, no parole. But, believe it or not, that wasn't the end of it.
This is where my brain starts to melt, right?
Hold on tight because it gets even wilder. They dismissed one of the things they used to give him the harsher sentence in the first place. And that meant they had to have another sentencing hearing.
Okay, I'm not a lawyer, so what does that even mean? Things they used to give him a harsher sentence.
Good question. It's called an aggravating factor. It's basically something that makes the crime seem worse in the eyes of the law. In Tiller's case, they decided one of those factors wasn't valid, so they might give him a lighter sentence. The prosecutors, they wanted another life sentence, or at least 160 years, but his lawyer, he actually argued for the minimum, just 20 years.
Whoa, that's a huge difference. Why would they even consider something that low?
The defense argued that, yeah, Tiller was involved in the murders, but anything more than 20 years was too much. They were saying that he wasn't guilty enough for the absolute worst punishment.
It makes you think, how do you decide what the right sentence is, especially when you have multiple people involved and they all played different roles?
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance, holding someone accountable, but also thinking about, can they change? Can they be rehabilitated? And remember, this was Illinois back in the early 80s. The rules for sentencing were probably totally different back then.
So what happened in the end, after all that back and forth?
Get this. Tiller got out of prison in 2019.
Seriously, after all that, he just walked free.
I know, right? But hold on, there's a twist. They sent him back to prison because he violated his parole. And then, get this, they released him again in 2022.
Talk about a roller coaster. It really makes you think, does our justice system even work? Is a life sentence really a life sentence? And what does it say about rehabilitation and keeping people safe when someone who did such awful things is just allowed back into society?
Those are tough questions, and people are still trying to figure them out. And you have to remember, These conversations, they bring up a lot of strong feelings. But it's important to listen to different points of view.
Totally agree. But we can't forget about Andre Jones and all this. He was still on death row, right?
He was, but something big was about to happen that would change everything for him.
You're talking about the Ryan commutations, right? What was that all about?
Yeah. In 2003, the governor of Illinois, George Ryan, he did something really controversial. He commuted every single death sentence in Illinois. He said he was worried about people being wrongly convicted, about racism in sentencing, and just the whole morality of the death penalty.
Wow, that's a big deal. So Jones's sentence changed from death to life in prison just like that. Wonder how he felt about that.
And what about the families of the victims? Think about what they must have gone through. Relieved that the guy who killed their loved one wouldn't be executed, but also angry, like it wasn't fair that he got a second chance.
Sure. The article actually quotes one of Stoltz's daughters. She was furious about Jones's commutation. She said, "I hope that when Ryan gets to hell that he and Andre Jones have a real good time together."
It shows that justice isn't just about what happens in court. It's also about the victims and their families and the impact these crimes have on them.
So now Jones is in prison for life, and Tiller, after all that legal drama, he's out again. But even with all that settled, there are still so many unanswered questions.
You're right. And some of the most disturbing ones are about Andre Jones and just how much violence he was really involved in. Remember, he never even went to trial for those 1971 murders that he confessed to when he was a teenager.
And then there were the Wallace murders. Michael and Dora Wallace murdered in their own home in 1978. The article says that Jones actually decapitated Michael Wallace. That's just horrific.
It's awful. And again, Jones was never tried for it. It makes you wonder, what else did he do that we don't know about? Are there other victims out there?
That's a scary thought. It brings us back to that question we had before. Could someone have done something, intervened in Jones's life somehow, and maybe stopped him from going down this road?
It's tough to say. Was he always going to end up like this? Or were there things that people could have done, things society failed to do, that pushed him towards this darkness? It's a debate that's still going on today, and it's one we need to keep having.
Yeah, and it's not just about Jones and Tiller. We need to be asking these questions about all kinds of violence, about the choices people make, and how society influences those choices.
I agree. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more thing that adds another layer to this whole story. Remember how we said that Jones and Tiller weren't the only spree killers in East St. Louis back then?
Oh, yeah. Gervais Davis and Richard Holman. It's crazy to think about two sets of spree killers in the same place at the same time. How's it even possible?
It's like something out of a movie, right?
Yeah.
But it also tells us something about East St. Louis back then. What was going on in that community that allowed this kind of darkness to take root?
And what was it like for the police and the people living there to have two sets of killers on the loose at the same time? It must have been terrifying.
Totally. Imagine the fear, not knowing who to trust, the pressure on the police to catch these guys. And the article says that all four of them got a lot of media attention. That adds a whole other dimension to this.
Right. All the news coverage, the public wanting answers, the police scrambling to solve these cases. It must have been chaotic.
And how did that media coverage affect how people saw these guys? Did it help the investigation or make it harder? Those are all good questions.
It's amazing how one case can lead to so many other things, how it connects to so many different parts of society and human nature.
Yeah, it shows how the deep dive can really get into the details and find connections that you might not see at first.
And speaking of connections, I'm really curious about Davis and Holman. Do you think we have time to talk about them a little?
We don't really have time to get into their whole story in this episode, but I mean, it's definitely worth checking out. The thing is, their crimes, just like with Jones and Tiller, they're mostly in that East St. Louis area. Why is that? And why were those communities hit so hard by this kind of violence?
Yeah, it's a question that goes deeper than just those specific guys. It's about what was happening back then, the poverty, the lack of jobs, all those inequalities. That kind of creates a breeding ground for crime, doesn't it?
Right, exactly. It's like when you're trying to figure out a disease, you got to look past just the symptoms. What are the underlying conditions that made it possible in the first place?
So where does all this leave us? We've looked at Jones and Tiller, their crimes, all the legal back and forth, and all the questions that are still hanging over this case. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And I think it leaves you with this feeling of, I don't know, unease. Like this could happen anywhere, right? People are capable of terrible things. And the reasons why, well, they're complicated.
But it also shows how important it is to try to understand, to search for answers, even when they're hard to find. We can't just ignore these dark parts of human history.
I agree. These deep dives, they're kind of like we're doing a forensic investigation, but of the human soul.
Oh.
We're sifting through the evidence, trying to put the pieces together, even though we might never have the whole picture.
And sometimes, maybe the most important thing isn't finding all the answers, but asking the right questions.
No, well said. With Jones and Tiller, those questions are all about accountability, justice, does our legal system even work? And can people really change after doing something like that?
And maybe the biggest question of all, could any of this have been prevented?
That's a question we should always be asking, not just about this case, but about all kinds of violence. How do we make the world safer and more just?
So to everyone listening, I really encourage you to dig deeper into this story. Look into East St. Louis in the late 70s, maybe even read up on Gervais Davis and Richard Holman. The more we know, the more we understand, the better we can prevent things like this from happening again.
And remember, knowledge is power, but it also comes with responsibility. Use it wisely, with compassion, and to make a real difference.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and stay curious.